There is almost nothing that I love more than the public library. Ever since I was a kid, I adored going through those doors, going through those shelves, and discovering all sorts of magic. And even with the internet at my disposal, seemingly with everything available from a click of the mouse, library is still the best. I still go all the time. I discover stuff that I never even considered reading, and this is what this video is about. I went to the library recently and went to the section I always go first, which is the graphic novel / comic book section. The reason I do that is because those things just pop out at me. I usually can just look at the cover, flip through it, and get an idea of what it is, and it's always filled with books that I always considered reading, but it wasn't until I saw them in front of me that I decided, oh, I should finally check this out. So, I recently was walking through downtown in Toronto, and I went to a Toronto Public Library and grabbed a couple of books, and I'm going to share with you now my favorite ones. Starting off with Mermaid Saga. Now, Rumiko Takahashi, super famous manga artist. She did Ranma 1.5 and Mermaid Saga. Now, I had seen this one just walking through the shelves, but nothing really caught my attention. I'm not a very big mermaid person, so I assumed, oh, okay, I know this is probably for younger readers who just love the idea of mermaids, and I walked through until I heard on Mangasplaining, the podcast episode I've mentioned a few episodes ago, that it's great. Every page is a wonder, and it's only 2 volumes. Ranma 1.5 is a almost insurmountable amount of content, and while I will start getting into it, Mermaid Saga, much easier to digest, especially to get Takahashi's style, which is present everywhere since I was a kid, but it wasn't something that I really dove into, and oh boy, Mermaid Saga delivers. This cover is very misleading. Mermaid Saga is the story of a man, this guy right here, who's wandering through the countryside because he ate the flesh of a mermaid 500 years ago. And ever since then, he's immortal. And he's trying to figure out how he can lose the curse of immortality and just live a normal life, getting old and such. And this book, from that premise, it could be romantic. I mean, you could get a lot out of that. But instead, it is just a thrilling action, horror, adventure manga. Each chapter featuring the characters wandering about, meeting the mermaids or immortal people, and there being a new twist to the formula. The mermaids themselves are, spoiler alert, horrifying monsters. And if you eat the flesh of the mermaid, the chances of you becoming immortal are very, very thin. So what you get is our hero meeting a bunch of people, meeting mermaid monsters. Look at him here. He's stabbed, seemingly left for dead. Even in this book, the heroes are buried a number of times and fighting the devilish mermaids. You would not get this kind of stuff from the cover or the title Mermaid Saga, but it's all here. It is 2 volumes. I'm definitely checking out the second one. Okay, something frustrating about libraries, even though they have tons of stuff, I appreciate the curation, especially at the Toronto Public Library. Nothing more infuriating that there's like 6 copies of Mermaid Saga that you can put on hold. No copies of Volume 2. It's available electronically, which is cool, but I want to read the paper book, and the fact that you don't have the second volume is infuriating. Even though, perhaps, oh man, look at this. This is like a monster dog that ate the flesh of the mermaid that the hero has to fight here. Just great stuff. Violent, in your face, fast paced. Each kind of like anthology is just 1 chapter, so it gets all wrapped up in a limited amount of pages. If you like action, adventure, horror, you gotta check out Mermaid Saga. Perhaps a lot of people already know about Mermaid Saga. I mean, Rumiko Takahashi is super famous. She's one of the greatest manga artists ever. I mean, Ranma 1.5 is legendary, probably in the top 5 best known manga / animes ever. But I did not know about this, and there's probably more people like me out there, so check your local library, see if they have Mermaid Saga in stock. Next up, it is another classic. It is Donald Duck Lost in the Indies by Carl Barks, the ultimate duck artist who kind of defined the adventure Scrooge McDuck canon. What, you didn't know that Scrooge McDuck had wild adventures? I mean, if you're my age or around, you probably heard of DuckTales, which was kind of an adaptation of the Carl Barks stories. And while Lost in the Andes is the one that I always see on shelves at used bookstores and at the library, I was a little bit disappointed by this one because this is very, very early Carl Barks comics. These are all Donald Duck related. Carl Barks, early on, he worked at Disney and did Donald Duck animation, working in the story department. And while it does feature Scrooge McDuck very briefly in some of the stories, he is not the character that he would become. As they say in the supplementary text in this book, he's kind of an asshole. But you do get some great cartooning stuff. One of my favorite ones was the Christmas-related Donald Duck strip, where his nephews want a golden Christmas tree, and there is a witch who needs the nephew's tears to end all of Christmas. And just full of almost, I gotta say, like Looney Tunes style gags. Lots of morphing into different things. There is one gag that made me laugh out loud where Donald is trying to save his nephews and he grabs a big stick and then the witch turns a wood chipper to appear right in front of it, and then he puts the log in the wood chipper and it makes papers that say "Witch foils housebreaker." Great gag. Laughed out loud when it happened. And this feels kind of like an introductory thing to the Carl Barks Donald Duck oeuvre. I do want to read actual Scrooge McDuck stuff, and while some of these stories left me a little bit cold, the presentation in this is excellent. The introduction by Donald Alt is great, just giving you a background of Carl Barks and what he's done. I mean, it starts right away with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg climax the opening scene of 1981's Raiders of the Lost Ark with the now iconic huge boulder chasing down the hero. They were referencing a shot from a Carl Barks comic strip. So I'd rather read those than these really early introduction stuff, but it was still a pleasant experience, and it's not the simple kind of Disney-style comic books you would expect just by reading this. I mean, Carl Barks was the guy. He defined his art and life doing duck strips, and you can see the kind of, seeds being placed here. I mean, it even ends with a bunch of gag strips. I really enjoyed the supplementary material where they kind of gave contextual information about each comic. I mean, one of them is called Voodoo Hoodoo, and is it problematic? Yep, it definitely is, and the text in this discusses it. I'd be curious to know why these particular stories are the ones that were selected, and it never gets particularly discussed, but what are you going to do? This is the book that it is, and for some reason it has a huge print run. You can find it everywhere, so if you're interested in Donald Duck, check this out, but I would not recommend this one as the Scrooge McDuck starter kit, because I've read some many years ago that were much more compelling than this kind of stuff, and it's not really adventure comics, it's mostly gag stuff. Next up, we have more manga, and this one is from the master, Osamu Tezuka, the guy who created Astro Boy. He's known as the god of manga, but I feel like a lot of his stuff is considered, classical, but doesn't get checked out that much by people who are just slightly curious like me. I've been really getting into his stuff, trying to read anything that is published in English, and the Book of Human Insects is one that I see all the time, never read, so I decided to finally check it out. I really appreciate his long-form work as well, because you get a sense of character and him experimenting. This one is essentially a noir story, and it's about a woman who is a leech/black widow going around and sucking people's talents or copying their talents, making a name for herself as she leaves them dry. And it's a 4-chapter book. Each chapter is basically about a different character that she sucks dry. But at the same time, there's a lot of depth there. There's a lot of experimentation from Tezuka. For people who are only lightly familiar with his work, his signature, while definitely Astro Boy, definitely inspired by, well, not inspired, basically the template of his work is early Walt Disney. When he was getting later on in his career, and this is definitely an adult book, it is not one for children, you get him being weird. You get him experimenting. He was never someone to rest on his laurels. And so you get tons of different stuff that you wouldn't expect from the guy who created Astro Boy. And this is, again, coming from the position of a novice. But this is dark stuff, and a lot of people complain that it doesn't work because of the kind of cartoony nature that you can get with some of the characters within these slightly realistic worlds. But I have always felt that I really like that, because the contrast between the simplicity of some of the character designs, the recognizableness of these characters reacting in what you would assume would be goofy or childish stuff set up in this realistic world is what makes it get such an impact. And this book is experimental as hell. There is so much interesting stuff that he's trying out, whether it be like metaphorical or just the way that panels are laid out. I just love his work, and I can't wait to read more of it. There's a lot of it that's been translated into English. A lot of it is out of print, and that's a little bit unfortunate, but if I'm lucky, hopefully, libraries have a lot more of it. Even though there is a lot that is difficult to get, especially some of his adult stuff, there are still a bunch of books that you will easily be able to find at your local library, like Dororo, which is a gigantic, massive volume, which I would highly recommend. Definitely check it out, The Book of Insects. My main complaint with this book is that Tezuka was a guy that created too much, and that sometimes you feel that because he was putting down the path as he was going, you realize that he doesn't really know where he was going. That sometimes the beginning, the middle, even the third act is great, but the climax leaves a little bit to be desired. And I felt that was the Book of Human Insects, where this story of a woman that's kind of destroying everyone in her path, at the end it just runs out of steam. Tezuka seems to wrap things up like everything ends, but I felt it a little bit unsatisfactory. But I would still recommend this wholeheartedly. It is a great book, especially for one that is unfamiliar with his adult work and wants to see what he can do. And very easily available. Finally, we're going back to Euro Comics. Wait, we didn't actually go to Euro Comics. I just always think of the Karl Barks Donald Duck as European style because it's reminiscent of the comics that I always read as a kid, because those are ones that would come from France. And I always thought that Corto Maltese by Hugo Pratt was a French comic book. But it is not. It's actually an Italian comic. And while it was published in French, actually says here in the back matter that Corto was resurrected at one point for the French weekly magazine Pif and moved to Paris, which is probably why I consider it a French magazine, even though that says at the beginning that this book was translated from Italian. Corto Maltese, I became aware of not when I was a kid, which is weird because I'm sure these books were everywhere in the library, my French school that I went to when I was a child. But I probably opened it up and flipped through it and went, it looks a little bit too simple to me. Like the lack of backgrounds, if you're just flipping through, and the kind of stiffness to the character. My young mind probably left something to be desired. I got interested in this, or it got on my radar, when I learned that Christopher Gaunt, the director of Brotherhood of the Wolf, Crying Freeman, Silent Hill, a director I really enjoy, was going to do an adaptation that was supposed to be released in 2020, but due to legal troubles never happened, and never will, because the producer Samuel Hadida unfortunately passed away. And so when I learned that, Christopher Gaunt wanted to do this, all right, I want to check it out. The pitch is simple. The main character is a roguish sailor captain who just goes on adventures. But what's interesting about this comic is that not only is it done in what I associate with an Italian style. I don't have that much experience with fumetti comics, but the few I've read, like stuff like Dylan Dog, these kind of elongated bodies and the sketchy style is something that I just associate instantly with Italian comics, and this continues that trend. So what's great about this comic is it's not just an adventure one, but Hugo Pratt was on the right side politically. If you compare this to Tintin, the racial politics are terrible in Tintin, super racist, and while this definitely, in this book at least, pushes up against those lines, Hugo is definitely tackling that stuff head on, very aware of it. Taking place in the 1910s, it deals with imperialism, colonialism, and our hero goes around saying that all the indigenous people he meets should be treated equally. There's some curveballs that are thrown where you think a character is being portrayed negatively or stereotypically, and that's just his strategy in the book itself. There's some caricatures that make me a little bit uncomfortable, but it is a rocking good read. And while the first story in this particular book, Under the Sign of Capricorn, which is not the first one, but is one of the good ones, at least that's what I read online, starts off a little slow. It just starts with like a lot of dialogue, people standing in rooms, sometimes there's no background. I'm happy I kept reading, knowing that I would make this video, because it kicks into high gear, and we are in full adventure mode by the end. to the point that I enjoyed this so much that I will keep an eye and probably read all of the volumes that are in this series of Corto Maltese. I love adventure books, I love anti-imperialist stuff, and this is right up my alley. This was recently published by Eurocomics, which was a IDW arm. And the only unfortunate thing is, I am not a big fan of incredibly thick paper. Like, this is what, like, more than 100-pound stock? Makes it a little bit difficult to read when I put it on the table and have to kind of like push it out because I don't want it to snap closed. I'm afraid that I'll break the spine, which I definitely do not want to do because it is a library book and I want as many people as possible to read it. So, if you see Corto Maltese at your library, and I feel like it's one that got bought a lot because IDW is a big publisher and this is kind of a canonical Euro book, check it out. You will have a blast. So, that is it for my Toronto Library finds. Those particular ones that I talked about were all ones that I just stumbled upon when I walked in the library. I hope you do the same thing, and that you go to your local library, go to the comic book section, check to see what's there. If you enjoyed this and would like to hear talks about film, which is usually my main area of expertise, check out the Important Cinema podcast, which is a show where me and Will Sloan go through a new cinema subject every week. Hopefully, you'll be able to find recommendations, new things to explore, which is always our goal. And don't forget to subscribe. The more subscribers I get, the more videos that I make. See you in the next video.